All right, shall we start? Let us In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. St. Thomas Aquinas. Pray for us. Great. Well, welcome back to the Summa class. So we finished up with the part we were doing, at least, on justice last semester. And in the cycle, in St. Thomas at least, the one that follows, justice is fortitude. And then we'll go back to prudence and temperance after that. So I think that what might be a neat way of us kind of delving a little bit more into the subject, since it took us pretty much the whole semester to go through the 12 articles of justice, I'm anticipating a similar sort of lifespan on this article about fortitude. But there's a lot of interesting questions that are underneath fortitude, because fortitude is certainly a virtue, but there's other virtues or vices that kind of are touching or connected to fortitude. And since we won't go over them specifically, I'd invite you, if you're interested, and I'm going to read through a few of them just to pique your curiosity, and be like, why does he say that? So I'm going to go through just a few of those things. These are under the heading or in the treatise on fortitude. You've got these other questions. So after the question on fortitude, 12 articles, you have martyrdom. First article after fortitude, martyrdom. Why would that be the first one? Well, we'll see in a bunch of the articles that we're reading that for St. Thomas, the key part, the key feature of this virtue of fortitude is martyrdom, which I don't think a philosopher would spontaneously say. So that immediately reminds us that the context of St. Thomas's reflection is theological, a theological reflection on the virtues, not a strictly philosophical one. So martyrdom would not be the first thing Aristotle would look at when talking about fortitude. That seemed pretty clear, straightforward. Okay, so what else do we have? Martyrdom, then fear. And it's funny, I'll go through all of these, but basically all of the ones that he talks about until patience are sins. And patience is after a whole litany of things. So some of these things that you wouldn't suspect are sins, are, at least according to St. Thomas Aquinas in his explanation, sins. So right after martyrdom, a question on fear. Is fear a sin? Whether fear is a sin. It would seem that fear is not a sin. Bah! We all know what that means. And then he gives us reasons. But so that might be an interesting one. If you're interested in that, that could be a neat thing to look at and bring to a discussion group that we've got on Fridays. I'll keep going. Fearlessness. Whether fearlessness is a sin. Fear is a sin. What about fearlessness then? It would seem that fearlessness is not a sin. Okay. Daring great things for Christ. It would seem that daring is not a sin. Oh, no! So it's interesting. I mean, with a grain of humor, we should be interested in what some of the reasons are behind these. The next question, on the parts of fortitude, so that could be interesting. So fortitude divided into different parts. What about magnanimity? Is and there he shifts the perspective a little bit, but that's a bigger question on magnanimity, which is an interesting question to look at because we interact a little bit with mercy in the question on magnanimity, whereas mercy come in, pity, magnanimity. What's this relationship to having a great soul? After magnanimity, presumption. It seems that presumption is not a sin. I don't know why it seems that, but I'm sure there's a good objection there. Ambition. It seems that ambition is not a sin. Okay. Vainglory. It seems that the desire of glory is not a sin. Interesting. Vainglory. So pusillanimity, which means it's the opposite of magnanimity, right? There's magnanimity, largeness of anima, largeness of soul, and pusillanimity, smallness of soul. So it's contrary. Whether pusillanimity is a sin, it seems that pusillanimity is not a sin. Okay. Magnificence. It seems that magnificence is not a virtue. Now, magnificence is generosity. It's like another word for generosity, not like your majesty. You're magnificent. Oh, magnificent one. Generosity. That's magnificence. Meanness. It seems that meanness is not a vice. Okay, well, maybe. Patience. It seems that patience is not a virtue. Oh, I don't know about that. Perseverance. It seems that perseverance is not a virtue. So as you're hearing these all kind of fall under the big heading of fortitude. So when you're thinking about fortitude, these are the kinds of questions, these different virtues or vices are the ones that are connected to that. So patience, perseverance, and then the vices opposed to perseverance. There's a question on that. Womanliness is one. Softness. It says effeminacy in the translation, but actually in Latin it's de molitiae, which is being too soft. It's nothing to do with being a woman, of course. So they are soft, from what I hear. Okay. So, finally, the gift of fortitude, and then the precepts of fortitude. And those are all of the questions under the heading, the treatise on fortitude. So if any of those that I just mentioned there are like, I wonder what he has to say about that, I would encourage you to take a look at it on your own and bring that to the discussion group. As we're going through the main article on fortitude, it will be kind of facilitating the reflection on what's contained in all these other questions as well. So it wouldn't be out of place to kind of bring something like that into the discussion. And so if you're like, I really wish we would be doing the question on patience or perseverance, but we're not going to get to that one in the class, that would be a great way to kind of draw the other stuff in that we probably won't get to. All right, so question on fortitude. After considering justice, we must, in due sequence, consider fortitude. Dixit St. Thomas. We must consider the virtue itself of fortitude, its parts, the gift corresponding thereto, the precepts that pertain to it. Concerning fortitude, 3 things have to be considered. Fortitude itself, its principal act, martyrdom. Wow, that should surprise you just a little bit that that's the principal act of fortitude. Especially because, how often have you been a martyr for your Christian faith? I mean, the full martyrdom, like you're dead. Not yet. All right, the vices opposed to fortitude. Okay, what all those are. Under the first heading, there's 12 points of inquiry. So this article is going to deal with those, these 12 articles are going to deal with them. So the 12 articles that we're going to be looking at more specifically, which you have there, hopefully in front of you. First one, whether fortitude is a virtue. Then whether it's a special virtue. Remember that theme of question from our last discussion, special virtue. Whether fortitude is only about fear and daring. Whether it's only about fear of death. Whether it is only in warlike matters that we could talk about fortitude. Whether endurance is its chief act of fortitude. Whether its action is directed to its own good. Whether it takes place in its own action. So they're a little bit more abstract, those questions. Whether fortitude deals chiefly with sudden occurrences. Whether it makes use of anger in its action. Does anger help you to have that virtue of fortitude? Good question. Whether it is a cardinal virtue, and then, so question, how to understand that it fits in with the cardinal virtues, and then it's of its comparison with the other cardinal virtues. Great. Well, let's not waste any time. Let's jump right in. You guys ready? You pumped? That's a word that we use for enthusiasm, I think. Pumped. Okay. First article, whether fortitude is a virtue. Start here. Work our way around.
Okay. Objection 1. It seems that fortitude is not a virtue. For the apostle says, virtue is perfected in infirmity. But fortitude is contrary to infirmity. Therefore, fortitude is not a virtue.
Interesting objection. Now, when I read this objection, I said, where does it say virtue is perfected in infirmity? That's a good reaction to have. So 2 Corinthians 12:9, what verse is that? Should know it a bit. I mean, even if you don't have it memorized, you're familiar with it. So that's the verse where Paul says and he's commenting about the thorn in his flesh, and he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Of course, St. Thomas is using the Latin of that, which goes much more like sufficit tibi gratia mea, nam virtus in infirmitate perficitur. So we know where he's pulling the word for sickness and virtue. This is this Latin translation. So the word for virtue, as we know, is another word for power, right? In your weakness, my power is made perfect. So in your infirmity, my strength, virtue is made perfect. My power is made perfect. So this objection is leaning on that particular scripture verse, which has its whole context. Paul is witnessing his inability to do what he wants to do. I don't do the good that I want to do, and the bad that I don't want to do, that's what I do. And so he's pulling that, St. Thomas is pulling that into this objection. It seems that fortitude is not a virtue, for the apostle says, virtue is perfected in infirmity. My power is made perfect in weakness. And virtue is the opposite of weakness. It's strength. And fortitude, as its name says, is strength. Above all virtues, fortitude is like the strength of virtue. So, fortitude couldn't be a virtue in this objection. Why? Because God says that that's not the way things work. Interesting objection. You guys see any other points in there? Maybe why do you think before we get to it, what is your thought on how St. Thomas might come back on this objection? It's real tempting to go ahead and read the body of the article. Of course, if you want to know what it says, that's good. But any thoughts as to what the difficulty might be here? Any thoughts at all about this?
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. I already read ahead. Waiting.
Like,
I was just thinking,
Sorry.
isn't Paul, when he's saying my power, he's talking about God's power, right? Like, it's just different than, that's the only thing that comes to my mind, is that it's just, like, completely different than, like, on a human level.
Absolutely. And I think that's crucial to see in these articles on virtues that are being treated from a theological perspective, that we're mixing, as we should, because that's the way it is in our real life, we're mixing these two levels, our divine life and our human life. And in our human life, fortitude is about being strong. And in our divine life, God is making his power manifest in us when we are weak, in our weaknesses. And those two things are both true. Now, how do we understand that lived out? How do we still seek these perfections of fortitude, this virtue of fortitude, when God is clearly saying that we're supposed to be weak in order for his power to be made manifest? Obviously, there's a good way to understand that scripture passage, and one that is not quite fully accurate. And a good way to be strong as a Christian, a strong Christian, right? My friends are strong Christians. Well, my friends are also weak Christians if they're real Christians. Because otherwise, this verse doesn't mean anything, and all of Paul's exhortations are meaningless. So this is a great objection to kind of put us in front of the problem that hopefully we see in our own lives. I'm supposed to be strong, and I'm not. Am I supposed to be getting stronger or weaker? And how is God really expecting me to just cash in my chips and wait for him to do something? These are the kinds of questions that hopefully we've at least thought about. Okay. So we've got on the one side here, right, virtue of fortitude. And then on the other side over here, this divine power that is perfected in, and when we say weakness, it's human weakness. And both of those are things that we should be familiar with as Christians. Okay, let's get to the body that everybody, as I've been babbling, has been busy reading. Go right ahead. Take all the fun out of it. All right.
Which one?
On the contrary. You're next. Yeah.
On the contrary, it goes to numbers fortitude among the virtues.
Okay. Well,
Next.
we have a father of the church saying that it's in there, so we're not going to throw it out. Body of the art of the.
I answer that, according to the philosopher, virtue is that which makes its subject good and renders its work good. Hence, human virtue, of which we are speaking now, is that which makes a man good and renders his work good.
Okay, so interesting point. How has St. Thomas shifted the perspective on virtue immediately?
From a theological to a philosophical. Right?
Okay, so so he is now coming at it from a philosophical perspective. And how has he shifted his perspective on virtue? If there in the objection we're looking at virtue as a power, here he sees virtue in what perspective? Just these first couple sentences.
Well, it sounds sounds like a power because he's saying that it's that which makes its subject good. Isn't that a power?
But the focus is on goodness.
Okay.
I think that's important. Because any of this discussion that we've looked at up to this, the focus is on that, the virtue as a kind of power. And in Greek the word is dunamis, right? Virtue is a kind of strength. And here, Thomas immediately pulls the focus of virtue to good, the good. So we're not looking at virtue in order to consider fortitude well for this theological perspective. We have to look at it more in the perspective of how virtue is for what is good, makes a man good, renders his work good. So it doesn't make man's work more powerful. It doesn't make man more powerful or more capable or better at doing things, which we could be tempted to think fortitude. But the real end, the real aim of fortitude here is the good. And all this is looking at that sort of manifestation of the virtue of fortitude, which is a power, a strength, control, self-control. That falls into fortitude. This is the same kind of, all of the things that we looked at, the endurance, the patience, that all, as we see those qualities in people, we're drawn to that. We're like, that's what it means to be strong, to have the virtue of fortitude. And St. Thomas is saying, well, these virtues, what they're for is goodness. And that reorientation is incredibly important, because it's different to be strong for the sake of being strong because you're supposed to be strong, and being strong because of something that's more important, because of a good that needs to be defended or protected or upheld or advanced. So the perspective on goodness takes us out of this formal understanding of virtue, right? This is the formality of it here. And here is shifting us into a perspective on the end, or the finality. My action as a human being, as a man, is supposed to be good. And so, if we're talking about the virtues, we're talking about what has perfected me in terms of acting for the good. All right, let's keep reading.
Now man's good is to be in accordance with reason, according to Dionysius. Wherefore it belongs to human virtue to make man good, to make his work accord with reason.
Okay, so there we've shifted. That's good. Just a further development. So the aim then is good. And how is a man to be made good? Primarily here, just in what it said.
To make his work accord with reason.
Accord with reason, right. So in here, so once again, before any of this formal perception that we could have of fortitude, there's something that's even more important. It has to be in accord with reason. What is my actions aim at what's good? The first quality of that action, if it's virtuous, is that it's in accord with reason. It conforms to reason. Not that it conforms to an obvious movement of strength, an obvious domination, right? Because that's another virtue of fortitude. We could have the temptation to see dominating here.
Father, did you say that if an act is good, it will be in accord with reason? Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Did I
In
mishear
order
you?
for an act to be good,
Uh-huh.
that's in order for it to be virtuous, right? There has to be in accord with reason. And that here is more important than it being done with great strength or with great power or with great control, which would be the common ways that we would see from the outside someone that we would consider to be strong or have the virtue of fortitude. He's shifting our perspective majorly on this in order to help us see especially how that can be integrated with our life of faith. Because if we don't do this kind of shifting of perspective, then our fortitude as Christians will look a lot like the warlike fortitude of the people that are, just conquering nations. The strong ones. The martyrdom as the warlike martyrdom of defending one's country, laying one's life down for a country, and a heroic manifestation of fortitude, which is not the more common manifestation of fortitude, especially for Christians. Martyrdom is not the common way that we live that virtue of fortitude. Okay, let's keep going.
This happens in 3 ways. First, by rectifying reason itself, and this is done by the intellectual virtues. Secondly, by establishing the rectitude of reason in human affairs, and this belongs to justice. Thirdly, by removing the obstacles of the establishment of this rectitude in human affairs. Okay.
So let's try to just understand those briefly. Human will is hindered. Okay, before that. First, by rectifying reason itself. This is done by the intellectual virtues. Great. Obviously, in order for my actions to be in accord with reason, reason itself has to be reasonable. The first major difficulty, that's where education has that kind of primal role in the virtues. You have to correct things in reason before you could anticipate somebody living a virtuous life. That's why for citizens, it's so important that they be educated. How could you expect them to be good if they can't even think straight? You have to be able to think straight, think well, in order to act well. So there's a priority in thinking well. So first, the intellectual virtues need to be in place. Second, by establishing the rectitude of reason in human affairs. And this belongs to justice. So we looked at that, and that's really important. So there's man in himself thinking clearly, then man thinking clearly in his relationship with others, and what's just, the just exchange of goods, etc. Thirdly, by removing the obstacles to the establishment of this rectitude in human affairs. Interesting element that he has, that he's brought into play here. So intellectual virtues here, the moral virtues, especially that of justice. And then removing obstacles. Sounds like what virtue? It's fortitude. Right? Removing obstacles, overcoming obstacles, getting the idea of having an obstacle. That's where fortitude kind of, we see the virtue of fortitude is going to be interacting with obstacles, difficulties, obstacles, hindrances. That's where fortitude is going to start showing its head. We don't see justice dealing with obstacles. That's not really what justice does. Justice more immediately deals with fairness and exchange, with treating others, well, and then, but the moral virtue of fortitude is concerned with what could prevent or hinder or be an obstacle to acting for what is good or reaching that good. So there's a confrontation at some level. Use the word loosely, confrontation. Just in the sense that there's a facing of something that is an obstacle, something that's in the way, something that is a hindrance. How do we face difficulties, confront them? All of that is asking questions that have to do with fortitude. And that's this third way that man becomes good in his actions. So it's interesting that St. Thomas kind of sees that as the last sort of step, the culmination of the moral virtues, prudence and temperance and justice. And then when there are these obstacles to justice, perhaps even, that's where fortitude comes in as a virtue. To justice, but then to anything else, even in our own lives, without having to deal with the lives of others, fortitude is definitely involved. Okay. Now the human will is hindered. Go ahead. Let's see here. Now the human will is hindered.
Now the human will is hindered in two ways from following the rectitude of reason.
Okay, so there's two reasons why we don't choose what we ought to. That's what this little sentence is saying. There's two reasons we don't do what we know we should. Or what if our reason is clear, if our thinking is clear, we don't do it. Okay.
First, through being drawn by some object of pleasure to something other than what the rectitude of reason requires.
Okay, pause. What do you think that has to do with? Pleasure drawing us away. We've kind of talked about that a little bit when we were talking about justice. It doesn't have to do with justice, obviously, but that's the area of temperance, right? Temperance tempers the greatest pleasure. It keeps the pleasures that we encounter, as sensitive pleasures, from deterring us from the path that we know we ought to be on. I was going straight, and then the chocolate cake appeared out of nowhere, with complete disregard for my feelings, and convinced me that I needed to stop and to spend time with the chocolate cake and eat the chocolate cake until it was gone. And then I forgot what I was supposed to be doing, and I was late, and I made up excuses like, okay, so I'll stop talking about my problems. All right. So.
And this obstacle is removed by the virtue of temperance.
Thank you for removing it, virtue of temperance.
Secondly, through the will being disinclined to follow that which is in accordance with reason, on account of some difficulty that presents itself.
Okay, so what does that sound like? There's a difficulty that presents itself. Fortitude, right? So that's what, but yeah, there's a difficulty that presents itself. Now, sloth, that's a good question. Is sloth against fortitude, or is sloth against temperance? I'll let you work on that one. But it's a good question, because it's a good way to kind of clear out in our minds and see, well, wait, why is it that I don't do what I know I should do? Well, on one hand, it could be because I'm taking the easy way out. That's typically easy way out in the sense of what's more pleasant. And on the other hand, I could be not doing what I know I should be out of fear, right? I'm afraid. It's too hard. It's too difficult. I'll never make it, even though I know I should do it. I remember one time I was at Ecclesia, and I was the goalie, and somebody was about to take a penalty shot, and one of the other people on our team came up, and he had his gloves and his knee pads, and he'd been playing soccer since he was 3 months in the womb or something. And he's like, "Oh, I'll catch the goalie shot for you, Father." And I was like, "Okay." I totally backed out of like guarding the goal like I was supposed to, because I was afraid that I would miss it. And I looked at this other guy that had great skills of catching soccer balls. And then, of course, the other team booed me, rightfully so. And my own team was sort of like glad, but also like, I mean, you kind of chickened out. So there's the pleasant route, and then there's the route that we take simply out of fear. I'm too afraid of what this would look like. So sloth looks more like taking the easy way out, like relax, be easy. Sloth looks more like that. That's not, relaxing is not sloth. Fine. But that's what it looks more like. On the other hand, fear or despair, those are what are going to keep us from facing the obstacles that we ought to face with fortitude.
So I'm sure this will probably become more clear like as we go on, but the reason that pops in my head is because the way it's worded. So secondly, through the will being disinclined to follow that which is in accordance with reason on account of some difficulty that presents itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so that sounds like it could be either like fear or
it's the
weakness,
difficulty. The word is difficulty. And disinclined to follow that which is in accord of reason, on account of some difficulty that presents itself. So it's the difficulty itself that there would be a lack of fortitude. And I understand what you're saying. It would be easier. Easy is not a good word for it, because easy, in fact, could either be sloth or, just discouragement or just, abandoning. But there's some situations where you see these things in the news. Maybe that would be an interesting activity to kind of like train yourselves as you're looking at these. Next time you read a news article or something or whatever, and you're seeing that somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do or what they should have done, the good thing they slipped to one side or the other. Was it more clearly, a pleasure that drew them away, or was it a fear that they had that caused them to simply just not do it? Because that's where we see kind of the...
He's saying these are the only two things that really, when he says the human will is hindered in two ways for following rectitude of reason.
Yeah, I think that those are the two ways. Because it's either through a lack of temperance or a lack of fortitude. That when it comes to acting, we don't act in accord with reason.
Those are the two ways.
Well, outside of justice, right? There's no, and justice is different because it's dealing with other people. Here, it's inside of me, and I am reacting to a pleasure, or I am reacting to an obstacle or a difficulty. And in my reaction, I slip either one way or the other. There's not other ways that it's possible to slip. But that would be interesting. Could there be another kind of option? And I think that if you think about it, you'll see that all of those different vices fall under either fortitude or a lack of fortitude or a lack of temperance.
I'm just thinking of kind of like a lack of faith,
And where would that lack of faith probably be?
I guess you're saying it'd be a fortitude issue.
It could, or it could be simply pleasure. My faith teaches me this. It would be much nicer to do something else. And that's pleasure that would lead me to do something else. And the sin of lust is not committed like out of fear. I was so afraid that I lusted. No. It was like I was so distracted or whatever, or there was this other thing that was drawing my attention away. So the two ways that we can go, but faith, when faith comes in, faith is sometimes a challenge to discover a deeper good, and so it may not seem pleasant. But faith is also sometimes a challenge of martyrdom. People didn't want to be martyred in the early centuries of the church. Was that out of pleasure? I mean, I would say it's probably more out of fear. Because the pleasure is what's drawing you to something else, concretely. And the fear is causing you to avoid something that would be good. So there's the avoidance and then the being drawn towards something. But it's good to think about it, because those are the that's how in your own life, as you're looking at these things, was I giving in to something that was more agreeable, that I liked? And sometimes it could possibly be both. Like you could be having both phenomena going on. But in the end, when you sin, it's either you could have both, but there's one that would be, because of something more pleasant, or or seemingly more pleasant, apparently more pleasant, or something apparently that would not cause fear. Just put it that way. Okay. So second, in order to remove this obstacle, fortitude of mind is requisite. And interesting how he says fortitude of the mind, right? Not fortitude of the body, not fortitude of the emotions, not fortitude of the psychology, not fortitude of smell or whatever, but it's the strength of mind. It's that virtue of fortitude, right, that we're talking about, is not a physical strength. At least in its root, and what causes fortitude to be a virtue is not something physical. It's not the physical part of my body. It's not like, I feel like I've just kind of been a pushover my whole life, so I'm going to go to the gym and bulk up. And now that could possibly help you discover some mental strength, but it's not the physical strengthening of the body that's going to give you that virtue of fortitude. Nor is it the strengthening of a moral code, or the strengthening of, we could put it, at a lot of different levels. It's the strengthening of the mind, of the intellect. Wow, interesting. Fortitude of the intellect. How does what is spiritual strength? That's a good question for the virtue of fortitude. And it's a good question because we have so many examples of fortitude or strength that we could look at that are obvious, that have that manifestation. And then there's this hidden strength that's spiritual. How can we talk about a hidden strength? What does it mean to be strong? This is patience, strength of mind. It's this hidden thing. The meek will inherit the earth, a spiritual strength. Okay. Come back. Okay. You want to finish up, sorry? In order
to remove this obstacle, fortitude of the mind is requisite, whereby to resist the aforesaid difficulty, even as a man, by fortitude of body, overcomes and removes bodily obstacles.
Right. So by strength of mind and strength of body. A man who's physically strong gets rid of obstacles by his physical strength. A man who has this virtue of fortitude is mentally strong and is able to overcome the obstacle mentally. Mentally is not a great word because in English that covers a vast terrain. But when St. Thomas uses this word mental, obviously he's talking about the intellect.
Which is spiritual.
Which is purely spiritual. It's that spiritual part of us. Whereas this mental strength is sometimes, in our colloquial way of using it, this kind of whole strength. Mind, body, emotions, mental strength. The whole thing is there together. Well, mental strength for St. Thomas, when this word mens is being used, that's really referring to the Spirit. Okay. So that's good. We got a good grasp of the core of the article. Hence, it is evident that fortitude is a virtue insofar as it conforms man to reason, to that mind, that strengthening of mind in its conformity to reason, and not being able to act contrary to reason, even when it seems like you should run away. Okay, so objection 1. Gina? Oh, sorry. Let's just reread the objection, and then we'll hit the response.
It seems that fortitude is not a virtue, for the apostle says, virtue is perfected in infirmity. But fortitude is contrary to infirmity. Therefore, fortitude is not a virtue.
Okay. Anybody have any thoughts, if you haven't already read the response, as to how? Now, I know, and I'm glad that you're excited to know the rest, but sometimes it's good to linger on the question before getting to the answer, because it helps to your mind to think through it a little bit. Just a suggestion. Okay. Any thoughts on how, having read the body of the article, we could make sense of this objection? Virtue is perfected in infirmity. Fortitude is contrary to infirmity. Therefore, fortitude is not a virtue. What might be an approach that you would take, having just read the middle of the commentary of St. Thomas, the body of the article? What words would you pick out to try to clarify or respond to? What seem like the key words in that objection?
Virtue is perfected in infirmity.
Right, so probably the understanding of what the word infirmity means. How do we understand the word infirmity exactly? For example, can the Spirit be sick? Right? If we're trying to look at how this strength that we're talking about is a spiritual one, what is because infirmity is a word that we use for the body, right? That's our common usage of the word. Weakness. Can the Spirit be weak? I think that would be a good question. I would want to know if that was possible. Obviously know that we can, by sinning, weaken our spirits by, turning away from God. There's a kind of weakness there. If in being connected to God, if we're connected to God, is there any way to be weak spiritually? Physically, yes. Psychologically, perhaps. Temptations. There's a weakness in us. Virtue is perfected in infirmity. And then, obviously, remember that power is perfected in weakness. My power is made perfect in weakness. Once again, it's God speaking about His power, not ours. It's good to think, sometimes just to pause and to try to ponder this. But we won't spend more time doing that. Let's go ahead and read the response.
The virtue of the soul is perfected not in the infirmity of the soul, but in the infirmity of the body, of which the apostle is speaking. Now it What belongs to fortitude of the mind to bear bravely with infirmities of the flesh, and this belongs to the virtue of patience or fortitude, as also to acknowledge one's own infirmity, and this belongs to the perfection that is called humility.
Very interesting. Our own infirmity. What is our own infirmity? If it's not physical, what is it? The greatest sickness or weakness of man is pride. Right? If the contrary is humility, also to acknowledge one's own infirmity. What is my infirmity? Pride. Wow. And this belongs to the perfection that's called humility. And that we can make total sense of Paul's difficulty. My grace is enough for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. If you are able to be humble, then my power can be made perfect. There where you are weak, where you are tempted to pride, where you would like to be in control of yourself, where you would like to have this kind of strength where you dominate all of the things that you don't like about yourself. Paul lists all kinds of things he doesn't like about himself. He's got this thorn in his flesh, which he could get rid of. He had all these other problems before he was converted. And finally he was knocked off of his horse. Great that we use commonly to talk about someone being humbled finally, knocked off of their high horse. It was for St. Paul, that's where we got that term. Knocked off of his horse. Wow, that's great. What an interesting thing to see. Sickness, illness of man. Principally, in his mind, that weakness and that illness is pride. So, if we want to become strong, we have to become humble. Wow, that's the theological conclusion, right? That's not the philosophical conclusion. That's the theological conclusion, which Revelation helps us to understand. If we didn't have Paul's little discourse there about God, we would not be able to conclude that the illness of man is pride, and it can be cured, and man can become strong by the grace of God. In becoming humble. Great little insight. Good stuff. Any questions on that? Any thoughts?
I don't know, I think I understand what you're saying about pride. I think maybe it doesn't matter, but I'm probably just really tired, but I'm not tracking with this train of thought through the reply, but
Okay.
Maybe it's not important.
Well, if you're able to pick out some words to come up with a question, write it down. You can keep trying to get to the bottom of it. Good. Okay. Next, visitors are allowed to participate.
Second objection.
Yes.
Further, if it is a virtue, it is either theological, intellectual, or moral. Now fortitude is not contained among the theological virtues, nor among the intellectual virtues, as may be gathered from what we have said above. Neither apparently is it contained among the moral virtues, since according to the philosopher, some seem to be brave through ignorance or through experience as soldiers, both of which cases seem to pertain to act rather than to moral virtue, and some are called brave on account of certain passions, for instance, on account of fear of threats, or of dishonor, or again on account of sorrow, anger, or hope. But moral virtue does not act from passion, but from choice, as stated above. Therefore, fortitude is not a virtue.
Okay. Do you guys understand the objection there? Could somebody put it in just real simply, in other words? Try to. It's fine too.
saying that doesn't seem to fit into any of the three categories of virtues, and he focuses on why it can't be a moral virtue, suggesting that maybe it actually is a moral virtue. Because I spent so much time talking about it.
Probably, yeah. So the inconsistencies that he's talking about have to do with what? What does he see as the philosopher's objections? And then he uses the word bravery. So this is the first time that we see bravery coming in. Bravery is like the substitute virtue for fortitude.
Just that people who evidently don't have fortitude seem to have the appearance of it.
Might have what appears to, might be brave, or do brave things. How can you do brave things if there's no virtue of fortitude in there? Right? That's the question. So do you even need fortitude if you can still do brave things without fortitude? You could, I think, I never saw the movie, but there was the movie about that soldier guy who was a Christian and said he wasn't going to fight. Maybe you're familiar with this. Or he wasn't going to use a gun. But there were all of the objections, there was all the pressure that was put on him about, what that represented, and he was a coward and things like that. And the whole story was trying to show that there was a different kind of bravery that he exhibited that didn't have to do with like shooting a gun. I think that's where this reflection is coming from. It's like, what would make bravery truly brave? Well, if it's out of fear, you accidentally did something right because you were trying to run away, and then you saved. There's always those kind of funny stories about somebody who accidentally saved the day because they were trying to get away from the situation. They were trying to escape, and everybody's like, "Yeah, you did it! You saved us!" And it's like, "I did," but there was no virtue involved. But still somehow managed to pull something off that has this appearance of having done something great. So the objection here, I think, if I were going to sum it up, is to say that people do things that are actions that seem brave by completely other motives sometimes, out of passion. Rescuing the damsel in distress. Just but it didn't have to do with fortitude. It was just passion, driven by passion. Feeding your passion for the world. It's just this bravery, and there's this fortitude, and there's all these other things that can cause the same virtuous outcome, apparently. Fear of threats. I was afraid that they would shoot me, so I shot everybody else. That fortitude, out of fear. I was the fastest shooter, but it was out of fear. Anyway, okay, I think we get the objection. Next response.
Sometimes a person performs the exterior act of a virtue without having the virtue, and from some other cause than virtue. Hence, the philosopher mentions 5 ways in which people are said to be brave by way of resemblance, through performing acts of fortitude without having the virtue. This may be done in 3 ways. First, because they tend to that which is difficult as though it were not difficult.
That's a good one. So tend towards what was difficult as though it weren't difficult. Go ahead, next one.
And this again happens in 3 ways. First, sometimes this is owing to ignorance through not perceiving the greatness of the danger. Sometimes it is owing to the fact that one is hopeful of overcoming dangers when, for instance, one has often experienced escape from danger.
I usually make it out of these things alive.
Sounds like me procrastinating on my schoolwork. And sometimes this is owing to a certain science and art, as in the case of soldiers who, through skill and practice and the use of arms, think little of the danger of battle as they reckon themselves capable of defending themselves against them.
I'm going to call that technical skill.
Okay.
It's relying on a kind of technical skill.
Thus, Vegetius says, no man fears to do what he is confident of having learned to do well. Secondly, a man performs an act of fortitude without having the virtue through the impulse of a passion, whether of sorrow.
Wait, was that second? That was second, right?
Secondly,
Yep.
it says, yeah. Through the impulse of a passion, whether of sorrow that he wishes to cast off, or again of anger. Thirdly, through choice, not indeed of a due end, but of some temporal advantage to be obtained, such as honor, pleasure, or gain, or of some disadvantage to be avoided, such as blame, pain, or loss.
And that's really interesting. That last one, and the advantage or the disadvantage, that corresponds really to that clear division between pleasure and fear, right? I chose to do it because I perceived some kind of advantage. It was like I was miserable thinking about how we're at war and I could lose my life at any point. But think of all the glory that I'll get if we're successful. Think of all the honors. Think of all the people that will come and say, you're the best, you did it. And consoled by choosing that. Okay, so that is intemperance, right? Or the disadvantage, avoiding the disadvantage, the fear of deserting. If I run away, then they'll kill me anyway. Or I'll be mistreated or whatever. So I'd better just hang in here, even though it really stinks. So that's the fear or the lack of fortitude. And then here, pleasure. Okay, well that's really neat. And I think that gives us a lot of perspective on some of the difficulties that we've probably all, in one way or another, experienced in our life. Why don't we end there for this evening, and we will pick back up not next Monday because we'll have the session, but the following Monday. And then this Friday, if you want to take a look already at some of the other articles or questions that were in there that you were like interesting, patience or perseverance, pull some things out of there and we'll chat about that.